Hello and welcome back to another video. So today I'm building an entry-level next-gen PC for 2021 featuring one of the new NVIDIA 3000 series graphics cards. We're also going to be using one of AMD's new 5000 series CPUs, and we'll be featuring a Gen 4 M.2 SSD. The PC I'm going to build today is going to cost about £1,500, but I will give you some options to reduce that cost. And actually you can get a similarly performing PC for about £1,100, and I'll point those options out when we go through the parts. So this is going to be another full step-by-step PC build guide where I'm going to show you how to put all the parts I've got in front of me today together and come up with a fully working PC by the end of the video. So as well as showing you how to put everything together, I'm going to show you how to install Windows 10, any drivers or programs we're going to need to get our PC up and running. I'll show you how to install the RGB software and give you a demonstration of how it works. I'll show you how to enter and update the BIOS. I'll show you how to overclock the RAM, adjust the fan curves, and then at the end of the video we'll run some benchmarks and give you an idea of the performance you can expect from this PC. So if you've never built a PC before, you've definitely come to the right place. So we'll make a start looking at the parts I've chosen for today's build. For the case, I've gone for Antec's latest mid-tower chassis, the DF700 FLUX. If you're not familiar with the FLUX layout, it stands for Flow Luxury, and this case has lots of features that fit into both of those categories. For a start, the case comes with 5 included case fans, 3 of which are ARGB fans. As well at the back, you've got both a fan hub and an ARGB controller, both of which have motherboard control. In keeping with other cases in the FLUX lineup, the rear side panel has perforations at the bottom, down where the power supply and hard drive cage area is, and when you combine this with fans on the top of the power supply shroud, it draws extra air into the case and should offer some great cooling performance. So this case will accommodate up to a maximum of 9 case fans, and that's exactly what I'm going to put in it, giving you an idea of the case's maximum cooling performance. The case has only just been released in the UK, but I was able to find it on sale today for just over £73. For the motherboard, I've gone with MSI's B550 Tomahawk, which you should be able to pick up for around about £150. I've used this motherboard in a number of builds before and always been really impressed with both its looks and its performance. The motherboard has 2 M.2 SSDs, one of which will support Gen 4 drives, so this is going to be perfect for a next-gen entry-level PC. If you're not interested in using a Gen 4 M.2 SSD, you can of course pick yourself up a B450 board and save yourself around £50. For the CPU, I've gone for the Ryzen 5 5600X. This is a 6-core, 12-thread CPU, which should offer some great gaming performance. Availability of these CPUs is getting better, and I was able to pick this one up for £280. Keeping our CPU cool, I've gone for Lee's Galahad 360mm AIO, and you should be able to pick this up for around about £140. So I've decided to go with a 360mm AIO for this build for 2 reasons. The first is looks, and the second is I'm keen to give this case a really good test out and see what the best temperatures we can get in it. This is probably much more than we need to cool our CPU, and importantly the CPU comes with a stock cooler in the box. So you could of course use the stock cooler and save yourself £140 and put that money towards either upgrading your CPU or your GPU. Alternatively, you could save yourself around £40 and get yourself a 240mm AIO, and I'll put a link to some alternatives in the description. For RAM, I've got 32GB of Kingston's HyperX Fury RGB at 3600 MHz speed. And you should be able to pick up this RAM kit for just under £180. So that is probably more RAM than what you're going to need, and you'll probably have an equally good gaming experience with just 16GB of RAM. The reason I've gone for 32 is that's the kit that Kingston sent out to me, and I think 4 sticks of RGB RAM is going to look much better than 2, and I'm trying to show you this PC fully spec'd out. I would try and stick with the 3600 MHz if you can. That tends to be the sweet spot for the Ryzen CPUs. For storage, I've got 2 NVMe M.2 SSDs. So we've got a 500GB Gen 4 drive, which you should be able to pick up for around about £90. And we've got a 1TB Gen 3 drive, which you should be able to pick up for around about £110. So again, we've got lots of options here as well. You could of course just start with the 500GB drive and save yourself £110 and maybe add a drive in a later stage if you find you need more storage. Your alternative option would be to go with just a Gen 3 drive. You should be able to pick up a 500GB Gen 3 drive for around about £55, and I'll put a link to some alternatives in the description. For the graphics card, I've gone with the current entry model in the NVIDIA 3000 series, the 3060 Ti, which I managed to pick up for £369. So at the time of filming, availability of this card, like every other graphics card, is in short supply throughout the world. So if you do want to go with a different graphics card, with whatever you've been able to get your hands on, you still should be able to follow along to this build guide. For NVIDIA cards, the installation of drivers is going to be very similar. I have made previous build guides using AMD cards, and you'll find a link to one of those in the description, which should show you how to install the drivers. Powering the whole build, I've got an 850 watt fully modular power supply from Corsair. It's the RM850, which you should be able to pick up at the moment for around about £110. So again, you don't need to go with as high a spec of power supply as I've chosen for today's build, and you can get a 550 watt non-modular power supply from Corsair with all black cables for around about £45. So you'll find a link to that alternative in the description. So I'm going to finish with two additional items. The first of these is a triple pack of Lian Li Bora digital fans in silver. So the reason I say these are optional is this case is actually really well spec'd, and it has enough fans to perform really well. It comes with a rear fan, and it comes with a fan to use down at the bottom above the power supply shroud. The only thing is both those fans don't have any RGB on them, and I'm keen to show you this case looking as good as I can. And in particular, I think the silver on the Bora fans is going to go really well with the silver on our graphics card. The final optional item is some black and white power supply cable extensions from Cable Mod, and you should be able to pick these up for around about £45. So again, these are completely optional. They're not going to do anything for the performance of the build, but I do think they will improve the look of it. An alternative option you have is just to pick up a black and white cable extension for the 24-pin connector for around about £12. Okay, so that's all the parts. Let's get on with the build. The first thing I like to do in any build is to prepare the case. By that I mean removing any panels, dust filters, or anything else that's going to get in our way during the build. As we're going along, I'll point out the main case features as well. The side panels are held on with two captive thumb screws at the back. Once they have been loosened up, the panel can simply be slid backwards and lifted away. In the main compartment of the case, we've got an accessory box containing a fan. I'll show you it later on in the video. The front mesh panel can be removed by simply pulling it forward. And you can see at the front of the case we've got three RGB fans. There's no additional dust filtration, and we're relying on the mesh in the panel to act as a dust filter. On the top of the case we've got a magnetic dust filter which can simply be removed. The front I/O ports have some rubber stoppers in them. We can go ahead and remove these. This is our rear side panel, and you can see the perforated area the whole length of the bottom. So this is where fans mounted above the power supply shroud set to intake are going to draw air in through. To remove the side panel, we just need to loosen the thumb screws similar to what we did with the other side panel. Once the thumb screws have been loosened, we can simply pull the panel backwards and lift it away. Down at the bottom of the panel, we've got a magnetic dust filter. So looking at the back of the case, in the centre we've got our fan hub and ARGB controller. We've got our case cables coming down here, and there's Velcro straps helping secure them in place. Over to the right hand side we've got two dedicated 2.5-inch drives. These simply lift upwards. You can go ahead and install the drive. You would then just need to line things up again and then push the drive down into place. We've also got some holes here where you can mount 2.5-inch and 3.5-inch drives. At the rear of the case we've got an extra dust filter. So it simply slides out from the back, and it's going to provide filtration for the power supply's intake fan. We've got a hard drive cage down at the bottom where we can mount a further 2 drives. We've got a drive tray here, and we can mount an additional drive on top of the hard drive cage. This is where we've got our second accessory box. So we're not going to use any hard drives, so I'm going to go ahead and remove the drive cage so we have more room for cables at the bottom of the case. At the bottom of the case we've got 2 screws we need to remove. With the screws removed, we should simply be able to slide the drive cage backwards and then lift it away. And if you're planning on using this drive cage, you would need to remove it to mount drives on the top. You would simply set the drive on the top, turn it over, and then screw in from the underside. Your second drive would use the drive cage and slide in from the front, and you wouldn't obviously need to remove the drive cage to install a drive in that tray. I'm going to go ahead and remove the rear fan because we're planning to replace it for a fan that has ARGB on it. So I'm just going to follow the wire along to the fan hub and just remove the wire. The fan is held on with 4 screws at the back that we need to remove. Next, I'm going to give you a look at what's contained in the 2 accessory boxes that came with the case. So in the accessory box that came in the main body of the case held on with a cable tie, we've got a reverse fan. The reason I say it's a reverse fan is the fan blades have actually been altered. They've been turned round, so at the front of the fan we've actually got the rear of the fan blades, and if I turn things over, at the back of the fan we've got these plastic clips. This is actually the front of the fan blades. So turned over in this orientation, the fan is going to be intaking air up into the case. So as I mentioned, we're going to use fans that have ARGB on them, so I'm not going to use this in this build guide, but when I do my thermal testing, I will test out this fan and let you know how it performs. Importantly, the fan has a 3-pin connector rather than a 4-pin connector. Okay, so this is what's contained in the accessory box that was found in the hard drive cage. So we've got a range of screws. There's these smaller screws which have a little lip around the outside, and they're generally used to secure the motherboard to the back of the case, and I'm assuming as well they're for mounting 2.5-inch drives. We've got these slightly larger screws with a larger head on them, and these are generally used for mounting the power supply into the case. I'm assuming as well they're probably for 3.5-inch drive mounting as well, because we've got much more than what we're going to need to mount our power supply. I couldn't find a screw guide in the instruction manual, but that's what I'm assuming it's for. We've got some additional case standoffs. We've got some standard looking fan screws, and then we've got 8 longer fan screws, and they're designed to secure the fans on top of the power supply shroud. So you're actually going to screw them in from the top, and to do that you're going to need to use longer screws. We've got some cable ties for cable management and some additional Velcro straps for cable management, and then we've got some literature showing you how to install things in the case, and also a guide to the fan hub stroke ARGB controller. This is our motherboard. We're going to do as much work with the motherboard as we can while it's on the table, because it's much easier to work with it here than it is in the cramped confines of the case. So we're going to go ahead and install our CPU into this socket in the middle of the motherboard, our M.2 drives into these 2 sockets behind the heat sinks, and our RAM into these 4 sockets here, all before we put the motherboard into the case. So I just want to point something out on the socket. If you look at this corner in the top left hand side of the socket, you'll notice a little white marking. Likewise, on the socket itself, there's a little triangle on this corner, and none of the other corners have a triangle. So this is to help us line the CPU up in the right orientation in the socket, and there's a similar mark on the CPU which needs to be lined up with this corner of the socket. To prepare the motherboard to receive the CPU, all we need to do is open this little lever all the way to the right hand side. This is our CPU, and what you'll notice is I'm holding it by the edges. The reason for that is I don't want to damage these gold pins on the underside of the CPU. The other thing I wanted to point out, if you look at the corner of the CPU at the top of the screen, it has a little gold mark on it. None of the other corners have that gold mark. If I turn it over, the corner which was at the top of the screen is now at the bottom left hand side. You'll notice there's a little gold mark on that corner. So that's the corner we're going to need to line up with the mark on the socket. Okay, so I've got the CPU lined up the right way. All I'm going to do is hover it over the socket and let it fall into place. If it doesn't fall in, I'm just going to move it about a little bit, and at one point it will just fall into the socket like it has done now. Importantly, I'm not going to go pressing down on it where I can damage the pins. To finish installing the CPU, all we need to do is close the clip, and we've now installed our CPU. So our motherboard has 2 M.2 SSDs hidden behind these 2 heatsinks. Importantly, the 2 sockets aren't created equally. Only the one at the top supports Gen 4 speeds, while the one at the bottom supports Gen 3 speeds. And we've got a little clue with the marking on the heatsink here. So it's really important you look at your motherboard manual to check the speed of each of your sockets. Importantly as well, if you are using an older B450 motherboard, quite often if you occupy one of the M.2 SSD sockets, something in your motherboard will become deactivated. It may be 2 of your SATA ports, or it may be your PCIe lanes on your graphics card are going to be reduced. So it's always important you read the motherboard, see what each of the sockets does, see if there's any sacrifices to make, so you make an informed decision about which socket to occupy with your M.2 SSD. There's going to be no compromises for us installing them. All we need to remember is to put the Gen 4 drive here and the Gen 3 drive here. To remove the heatsinks, we simply need to loosen the screws, 2 on each side. With the screws loosened, we should simply be able to lift the heatsinks away. This is our M.2 SSD. If you look at the gold connectors over to the right hand side, this is what's going to plug into the motherboard. The gold semicircle over to the left hand side is where we're going to put a screw and secure the drive to the motherboard. So these are actually the two M.2 SSD sockets, and these standoffs are where we're going to secure our drive to. So the first thing for us to do is check the standoffs are in the right place, because you see there's 2 additional holes here. We could move the standoff to one of those if our drive was slightly shorter than what it is. But if I line our drive up, we can see this standoff is in the right place. Looking at the bottom socket, lining the drive up, this standoff here is in the right place. We've got an extra standoff here. It is important that we remove this. And again, we're just going to put this into the motherboard box. So to install our Gen 4 drive, all we need to do is insert it at a slight angle into the socket. Then we can take a screw from the motherboard box and screw the drive into place. Then we can go ahead and mount our Gen 3 drive into the bottom socket. Now it's going to be held on a slightly different way. The heatsink is actually going to screw into here and secure the drive and the heatsink with a single screw. If you actually use a screw from the motherboard box into here, you'll not be able to put your heatsink back on. Now, because we're using this motherboard for the first time, we've got some plastic protection over the back of the heatsink which we need to remove. Next, we just need to go ahead and line the heatsink back up again. So same thing with the bottom heatsink, we'll just remove the plastic protection. This is our RAM. If you look closely at it, you'll notice the 2 gold connectors at the bottom aren't of equal length. The one over to the right hand side is slightly longer than the one over to the left hand side. So it's really important when we insert it into the socket, we have it the right way round. Now, because we're going to be using all 4 sticks of RAM, we don't need to worry about which of the sockets we occupy. If the kit you have only has 2 sticks of RAM, there's a little marking on the motherboard that tells you it's the 2nd and 4th slot along from the CPU that you're going to want to occupy. So to prepare the sockets to receive the RAM, we just need to go ahead and open the clips on all the sockets we're going to put RAM into. Next, we need to line the RAM up with the socket. Once we're happy we've got things lined up, we just need to apply some firm pressure to the top. The RAM will click into place and the clip will close. We're now ready to go ahead and get our motherboard into the back of the case. If you look at the back of the case, we've got standoffs. There's 3 of them in 3 rows, and I've already checked they're all lined up in the right places for our motherboard. We've got additional holes at the back of the case, and remember in the accessory box we did have some spare standoffs, so if you're using a different size motherboard you may need to screw the standoffs in. Now, I tend to install the motherboard with the case upright. You will find it easier if you lay the case down on its back. The reason I do it is so you guys can get a good view of it. If you're using a different motherboard and it comes with a separate IO shield, you'll want to go ahead and install your IO shield first before you install the motherboard. So all we need to do is insert the motherboard into the case and try and get things lined up. Then I'm going to try and get a screw into the middle standoff, and then it's just a matter of getting the other 8 screws into place. The next thing I normally do at this stage is to go ahead and get the case cables plugged in. The reason I like to do it at this stage is with the moment we've got plenty of access to the motherboard. Once we start adding more things into the case, our access to the motherboard, particularly at the bottom and top, is going to become that bit more difficult. So what are the case cables? The case cables are the cables coming from the front I/O ports. So we've got a headphone and microphone jack, and we need to plug the HD audio cable into the motherboard to allow those to work. We've got 2 USB Type A ports on the top of the case, and we need to plug this USB 3.0 cable into our motherboard to let those ports work. Then we've got these tricky front panel connectors, and these control a whole variety of different things. So they control the power switch, the hard drive LED, and the power LED. Quite often there's a reset switch cable as well. We don't have one because it's being used in the fan hub. So we're going to need to plug all these in to let the features on the top of the case work. We also have some additional cables coming from our fan stroke RGB hub. So the first is a SATA power connector. We're going to need to plug this into our power supply to power the hub. Then we've got a standard 4-pin fan connector. We're going to need to plug this into one of the fan headers in our motherboard. This is then going to allow the motherboard software to control the fan hub. We've also got a 3-pin 5V addressable ARGB cable. We need to plug this into the corresponding header on our motherboard, and this is then going to allow our motherboard software to control everything that's plugged into the ARGB controller on the back of the case. The end of this cable comes with 2 different connectors. Most motherboards will use this cable, but Gigabyte boards will use this particular cable, so we can just ignore this end for now and just plug this end into our motherboard. So the first cable we're going to plug in is our HD audio cable, and it goes under this header over the far left-hand side of the motherboard. So we just need to bring it through the closest cutout. And if we take a close look at the cable and the header itself, you'll notice in the top row there's a pin missing. So we're going to have to plug this cable in the right way round, and that's with the HD audio text facing up the way. And then we can go ahead and pull the access cable out the back. Next cable for us to plug in is the 4-pin fan cable coming from our fan hub. And this is going to allow our motherboard to control the speed of the fans plugged into the fan hub. So we just need to go ahead and line things up and push the cable in. Okay, next lot of cables is to plug our front panel connectors in, and they're going to go over this header over to the far right of the motherboard. So it's really important you refer to the diagram in your motherboard manual so you plug the cables into the right pins. And in general, I would recommend plugging in the bottom row before the top row, because if you start at the top row, you're not going to be able to see them. It looks like I've done it in a different way in the close-ups. That's only so you can see all the cables in each of the pins. Okay, so starting in the bottom row, working from left to right, that is for hard drive LED positive and hard drive LED negative. So that is with the text facing down. I'll go ahead and plug that in. Okay, moving up to the top row, we've got power LED positive and power LED negative. So again, I'm just going to go ahead and plug this in with the text facing down the way. Next to that, we've got power switch positive followed by power switch negative. There's no actual positive or negative markings on the front of this cable, but on the back there is a little arrow marking the positive pin. Again, it doesn't matter which way this particular cable goes in, but I'm going to show you how to plug it in the right way round. So we're going to plug it in with the text facing down, and it's just into the next pins, and then we can go ahead and pull the excess cable out the back. Just above that header, we've got one of our addressable ARGB connectors. There's also one at the top of the motherboard, but I think it makes sense to plug it in down at the bottom. If we look at the header, we've got 2 pins, a space, and then another pin. So it's important we line things up with the cable the right way round. Okay, and then just pull the excess cable out the back. Next, our USB 3.0 cable is going to go in this header here over to the left-hand side. If we look closely at the header, there's a notch on the top of it, and if we look at the cable, there's also a notch, so it's important we line them up the right way round. Another thing to be really careful with this cable, out of all the cables, this is the easiest one where you can damage the pins. So if it doesn't go in easily, stop, realign things rather than just pushing. Okay, so we'll bring the cable through the cutout and we'll go ahead and plug it in, and then we can pull the excess cable out the back. So this is our power supply. As I mentioned, it was fully modular, which means none of the cables are plugged in. The big advantage for this is we only need to plug the cables in we're going to use. The disadvantage is it's that bit more expensive, which is why I've listed the cheaper alternative in the description. Okay, first cable for us to plug in is our motherboard's 24-pin connector, so it's going to go in and down at the bottom here. Next, we will need to go ahead and plug the cable providing additional power to our CPU. If we look at one end, it's marked CPU, so that's the end that's going to plug into our motherboard. So we just need to plug the other end into the power supply. Next, we need to plug in a PCIe cable to provide power to our graphics card. So this one cable has 2 6+2 pins, so 2 8-pin connectors. Our graphics card is only going to require 1 8-pin connector, so this one cable will be enough power for the whole graphics card. So I'm just going to go ahead and plug it into the next header along. Although we're not installing any SATA drives in our build, we are going to need a SATA power cable to power the fan hub at the back. So we can plug it into any of the cables labelled peripheral or SATA. Okay, if you're not planning on using the cable extensions, your power supply is ready to go. So these are the cable extensions I was talking about, and the idea behind these is you've got nicer cables in the front of the case on display, and then you don't see any of these black cables, although these cables are actually pretty good as far as power supply cables go. So all we need to do is plug them in to each of the cables we've already plugged in. So there's our 24-pin connector, line the notches up and push. Okay, we got the cable providing additional power to the CPU, line the notches up and push. And And then for our graphics card, I'm just going to line the 6 and the 2 pin connector up, take our cable and plug things into place. Our graphics card does have a special 12 pin connector on it, so we're going to have to use this 8 to 12 pin connector that comes with the graphics card. So I'm going to go ahead and plug this into the end of our PCIe cable. This is the power supply's intake fan, and when we install the power supply, it's important we install it with this facing down the way. This is going to mean the power supply is going to be over this cutout and getting fresh air from outside the case. Okay, we'll go ahead and insert the power supply into the case. And then we can go ahead and secure it into place using the screws from the accessory box. So our cable providing additional power to the CPU is going to plug into this header on the top left hand side of the motherboard. So go ahead and bring the cable through the cutout. So importantly, there's a notch on top of the header and also a notch on top of the cable. So we just need to line things up correctly. And once we're happy things are lined up, push the cable into place. Now this cable extension does have cable combs on it, so we can pull these backwards and help organise the cable, and then pull the excess cable out the back. Next we can go ahead and bring our 24 pin cable through. Importantly, the header has a notch on the right hand side and we've also got a notch on our cable. So we just need to line things up. Once we're happy things are lined up, go ahead and push into the socket. And again, we've got cable combs on the cable, so we can go ahead and use that to tidy the cable up. The last thing for us to do is to go ahead and plug the SATA cable coming from our fan hub into the power supply. There's L-shaped connectors on both of them, so all we need to do is line them up and push them into place. Next we can go ahead and install our case fan. So I'm just going to start off by feeding the excess cable out the back. And then we can go ahead and secure the fan using the screws we removed earlier on. Next we can go ahead and set our fans on top of the power supply shroud and feed the excess cables out the back. Now importantly, we are going to want to have the fans the opposite way round. We're going to want these as intake fans, so the front of the fan is going to have to face down into the case. So this is where we come to our first issue in this case. These are the long screws that Antec include with the case. Now they are designed for the Antec fans, which are obviously a little bit slimmer than this, because when we insert this all the way through the fan, it's not actually coming out the other side. If we go ahead and take the stock Antec fan and try the same thing, we'll feed that through, and you can see there's no problem there. The screw is long enough to come out the other side. So fortunately I do have some slightly longer screws, which I've got from my Lanco 2 mesh. So we can go ahead and feed the screws through the fans and then line them up with the holes at the bottom of the case. And then we can go ahead and screw things into place. Coming from each of the fans, we've got two cables. One is a standard 4-pin fan connector and the other is an RGB connector. We'll deal with the RGB connector in a minute, but let's go ahead and get all the power connectors plugged into our fan hub. Okay, so looking at our fan hub, over the right hand side we've got 3-pin connectors for power. The other 3 Lian Li fans are at the front, already plugged into here. Although our fans have got a 4-pin connector, it doesn't actually matter because there's little notches on the header and we've got notches on the cable, so there's only one way it can go round. So I'm going to line it up where the notch is facing backwards and plug it in. So rather than do what I'm showing you on the screen now, I would recommend you plug the 3 case fans into the fan headers on your motherboard. You'll see the reasons for this later on in the video. In our triple fan pack, you'll find a cable that lets us deal with the RGB cables. So each of the cables coming from the fans is going to plug into this triple splitter cable. On the other end, we have got a 3-pin 5-volt addressable ARGB cable. We have a number of options with this. We could go ahead and plug this straight into our motherboard, or we could go ahead and plug it into the ARGB controller at the back. It makes sense for us to plug it into the ARGB controller because then all the lighting in the case is going to be able to sync up nicely. Okay, so I'm just going to take the connector coming from each of the fans and plug it into the cable first of all. And that just leaves the job of plugging the other end into the ARGB controller. There we go. So we can now go ahead and start work on our AIO, and the first job to do is get the fans on the radiator. Now I'm planning on having this at the top of the case as an exhaust, so we're going to want the fans facing into the case. So this orientation is right. The other thing we're going to have to look at is where the cables come out. We're going to want these coming out the back of the case so you can't see them. I've already lined things up in the case, and I think the tubes over to the right hand side is going to look better. So in this orientation, this is going to be the back of the case, so these cables are in the right orientation. So we can go ahead and put all three of the fans on the radiator. And then secure them in place using the long screws that come with the AIO. Next, we need to have a look at the wires coming from each of the fans. So each fan has two wires coming from it. One is a standard 4-pin fan connector, and the other is an ARGB connector. So let's deal with the 4-pin fan connectors first of all. Okay, so that means we've got 3 4-pin fan connectors, but we've only got one CPU fan header. So in the kit, we're going to have a 3-to-1 fan splitter cable. So all we need to do is plug in each of the cables into the fan splitter cable. So that is now going to leave us with one 4-pin fan connector to plug into the CPU fan header. Okay, we've got a similar splitter cable for the RGB. It's a 3-to-1 connector. So we'll go ahead and plug the other end coming from each of the fans into the splitter cable. Okay, so that leaves us with one of these RGB connectors, but at the moment we're not actually going to be able to plug this into our motherboard or plug it into the RGB controller on our case. So there is an extra cable that comes with this kit. It's got a larger connector, a smaller connector, and then a 3-pin 5-volt addressable ARGB cable, which we can either plug into the controller on our case or directly into our motherboard. So all we need to do is plug into the larger cable here, and that leaves us with one extra connector, which is actually for our pump. So coming from the pump, we've got 2 connectors. We've got a 3-pin fan connector, which we're going to plug into the pump header on our motherboard. We've got a smaller RGB connector, which is then going to go into this other end of the cable. So then all we need to do is to control the RGB is to plug this either into our motherboard or into our case controller. So let's go ahead and get this into the case. The first thing I'm going to do is pull all the cables coming from the fans out the back. Next I'm going to go ahead and plug in our CPU fan header, bringing it back in from the back. And it is going to be the first fan connector here at the top of the case. And the reason I'm plugging it in at this stage is it's much easier to do before we put the radiator up at the top. Okay, so to get the radiator into the case, we're going to have to insert it in at a slight angle. I'm pulling the excess cables out the back as I do. So I'm going to insert it in at an angle. Next, I'm going to want to get some screws in at the top of the case. So I've still got 2 screws left, and the holes for them are just under here, but unfortunately there's a little bit of metal blocking them. But with enough screws on, there shouldn't be any problems leaving these 2 out. Okay, we can go ahead and replace the dust filter on the top. Next thing for us to do is to apply some thermal paste to the CPU. So I normally apply a pea-sized amount to the center of the CPU. Okay, that should do. Okay, if you're using the cooler for the first time, there'll be some plastic protection you're going to need to remove. I've used this before, so there's none there. The next thing for us to do is to get these clips on the cooler over the black clips on the motherboard. So I'm going to start up the top here first of all and try and get the top one on. So that's the top one on. Next I'm going to get the bottom one on. Okay, that's the bottom one on as well. All I need to do now is tighten each of the clips a few turns each time. So the top one a few turns, then the bottom one a few turns. And we're just going to alternate until things are tightened up. Next we just need to plug in our 3-pin connector into the pump header, which is the one next to the CPU fan header. So I'm going to go ahead and line that up with the header now and push things into place, and then I'm going to bring the excess cable out the back. Now I temporarily had plugged the RGB connector coming from the pump out of the way to make installation easier, so I'm going to pull that through the back. Okay, we'll go ahead and re-plug that cable into the splitter cable. And then the easiest thing for us to do is just to plug this into the RGB hub at the back. So I'm just going to line things up and push things into place. And actually you've one spare connector there if you had another accessory you wanted to use. Okay, we're now ready to go ahead and install our graphics card, and to do that we're going to need to remove the second and third PCI expansion slot cover. We're going to need to remove this guard first of all, so we loosen the thumb screws. We still should just be able to slide this backwards. Next we can go ahead and remove the screws from the second and third slot. So our motherboard does have two slots which would be long enough to take our graphics card. In general, you want to install your graphics card in the top slot to get the fastest speeds. So all we need to do is push this little clip back and we're now ready to install our graphics card. Okay, so all I need to do is line the graphics card up with the slot. Once I'm happy everything's lined up correctly, all I need to do is apply a little bit of pressure to the graphics card, it'll slot into place and the clip will close. And to make things a bit easier, I'm actually just going to go ahead and remove this guard altogether. Next, I can secure the graphics card into place using the screws we removed earlier on. Next, we need to power our graphics card, so I'm just going to bring our cable through this cutout at the back. Then we just need to line things up and push into place. And again, this extension cable has some cable combs on it to help tidy things up. Just before we go to the back of the case to do some cable management, I want to point something out. You can see the yellow here. The yellow is the little Velcro straps at the back for cable management. One side is yellow, one side is black. So I am going to reverse that round so it looks black at the front and yellow at the back. The Velcro mightn't work so well, but I don't think yellow shining through to the front looks very good. Last job for us to do is some cable management. We need to make this mess of cables go away so we can get the back panel on. If you look here, we've got some points for cable management and we've got additional Velcro straps and cable ties in the accessory box. We've got the Velcro straps here, we're just going to reverse that round so that the yellow side is facing the back. And we've got plenty of space down the bottom of the case for the power supply cables. So let's go ahead and get these cables managed. Okay, we can go ahead and put the rear panel back on. Okay, that's the PC built. Next thing for us to do is to power it on and see will it boot. Importantly, I don't expect this PC to boot because we're using a Ryzen 5000 CPU and a new B550 motherboard, which is unlikely to have an up-to-date BIOS out of the box that will let it work with Ryzen 5000 series CPUs. The reason I'm trying this though is maybe it does and I just don't know that, and I want to save you the step of flashing a BIOS if you don't need to. Importantly, I have loaded a Windows 10 bootable USB drive into the back of the PC. If you don't know how to make one of those, I've made a video on it and you'll find a link in the description. Okay, so we'll fire it up and see will we get a boot screen. Okay, so that's good signs. We've got lights, fans spinning, and we'll just watch the screen and see if we get a boot screen. If we do, great. If not, I'll show you how to flash the BIOS. Okay, so we've got lights now appearing on the keyboard. We'll keep an eye on the monitor. Okay, so looking at the monitor, it has picked up our CPU, it's picked up our memory, it's picked up our storage devices. So it's asking us to press F1 to run the setup or F2 to load the default values and continue. So we'll go ahead and load the default values and see what happens. So the next thing we're looking for is the PC to find the Windows 10 bootable USB drive and then boot off that, because obviously the SSDs we have installed don't have an operating system in them. So there's the Windows logo appearing, which is again is a good sign. Next thing we're looking for is the Windows installer screen, and we've got the Windows installer screen. So that's great and that works. You really don't want to be flashing a BIOS unless you have to. It's much better to update it later, and I'll show you how to do that. But we'll go ahead and get Windows installed first of all. And to make things a little bit easier, I'm going to switch over to the screen mode. Okay, as we install Windows 10, I'm going to pick the options that are relevant to me. Obviously, if you have different preferences, go ahead and pick the ones that are relevant to you. I'm from the United Kingdom, so I'm just going to click Next. Click Install Now. If you've got a Windows 10 product key, go ahead and enter it in the box here. If you don't have one, click I don't have a product key. You can then select which version of Windows you're going to get a product key for in the future. Go ahead and install it. Windows will work, but with some limitations until you enter your product key. I do have one, so I'm going to go ahead and enter mine now. We need to accept the license terms and click Next. We're going to go for a custom install. Okay, so our two drives are showing up as unallocated space. Our 500GB drive is the first one, and it's our Gen 4 drive, and that's where we're going to install Windows 10. A question I often get asked is, if you have two drives of the same capacity, how do you tell them apart? So what I've found in general is your SATA drives will come up first, then your M.2 drives, and your M.2 drives tend to go in order. So this is the one in the first slot, and this would be the one in the second slot. We don't have this problem because they're a different capacity and they're easy to see. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next. So this next stage will take a little bit of time, so I'll go ahead and speed things up. And then again, between every step, I'll speed things up for you. Okay, so again, I'm from the United Kingdom. I'm just going to go ahead and click Yes. I'm going to select the United Kingdom layout for the keyboard. I'm going to skip a secondary keyboard. I'm going to set up for personal use. Click Next. So if you have a Microsoft account, you can go ahead and put your details in. If you don't have one, you can create an online account, or if you prefer, you can create an offline account. I'm going to put my details in now. We then need to create a PIN. I'm going to click Don't use online speech recognition. I'm going to let apps use my location. Yes to find my device. Just the basic data. No to inking. No. No. I'm going to click Do it later. Only save files to this PC. No thanks. Not now. Okay, that's Windows 10 installed. The first thing I like to do before installing any drivers and programs is get Windows fully up to date. So go ahead and click on the Windows icon, click on the Settings tab, and then click on Updates and Security. We're going to click on Check for Updates. What's going to happen, Windows is going to find quite a few updates. It's going to go ahead and install them. The computer may need to start a number of times between the installation, but we're going to keep coming back and checking for updates. And it's only once all the updates are installed, we're going to go on to the next stage. Okay, that's Windows fully up to date. Whenever I click on check for updates, there's no more updates found. Next thing for us to do is to get all our SSDs to show up, because if I go over to this PC, what you'll notice is only our boot drive is showing up, but we actually have two M.2 SSDs installed. So to get them to show up, we need to type disk management into this bar down the bottom. And then we'll click on the shortcut Create and Format Hard Disk Partitions. So a pop-up will come up asking us to initialize the disk. We're going to click OK. And then what you'll see is we've got disk 0, which is our boot drive, and disk 1 is now showing up as unallocated space. If we right-click on this, click New Simple Volume, Next, Next. It's assigned the letter D. If we want to change that, we can do so from the pull-down menu. Click Next. We can name the drive. Click Next, Finish. And what you'll now notice is both of our drives are now showing up. The next thing I want to do is update the BIOS. We're over on our motherboards page on MSI's website, and this is where we'll come to get some of our drivers after we've updated the BIOS. So the first tab that opens is the BIOS, and we can see the different versions that are available. So we've actually got a fairly up-to-date version just released on the 26th of January. So I'm going to go ahead and download this. Then if we head over to our Downloads folder, we'll double click on this to open it. So it's this bottom file which is actually our BIOS file. So I'm going to copy this. And then I've plugged an external USB drive into the back of the PC. So I'm going to click on this and paste the file into here. Okay, next thing we need to do is restart our computer. So click on the Windows icon, the power, and click on Restart. What we need to do is whenever the screen goes black, we're going to start pressing the delete key. What we need to do is time the delete key with the MSI logo appearing. I normally find it's much easier just to start pressing it rather than try and time it. So the logo should be appearing any minute. And this is taking us into the BIOS. There is some settings that we're going to need to change in the BIOS, but rather than do that, update the BIOS, which will reset the settings, it's better to go ahead and update the BIOS first of all. So we can see the version that we've got here is from the 3rd of the 9th, 2020. So we definitely have a later version. So to update the BIOS, we're going to need to click on the M.Flash utility. And we're going to click on yes. Okay, so before we start, just a word of caution about updating the BIOS. You should really only update the BIOS if you're having problems with your computer or the new version offers features that you're going to need. Obviously, because we have one of the newer CPUs, I do want to go ahead and update the BIOS. The reason is, if things go wrong during the BIOS update, you can actually brick your motherboard, and it's really important your computer does not lose power during the BIOS update. So what we can do is we can go scroll down here and we can see the file that we have downloaded. So I'm going to go ahead and click on it. It's asking, are we sure we want to select this file? We'll click yes. And then it's going to go ahead and update the BIOS, and we'll see the progress in the taskbar down at the bottom. Okay, so after successfully updating the BIOS, the PC has rebooted back into Windows. So we're going to go back into the BIOS and update some of the settings. Okay, the first thing for us to do is to have a look at our memory. So we click on the memory tab, we can see the memory is currently running at 2400 megahertz. But if we look down here, we've got two XMP profiles, which both are at 3600 megahertz, so in fact exactly the same. So I'm going to go ahead and enable profile 1. The next thing I want to do is to go over and have a look at our fans and check they're running the way we want them to. In fact, I'm almost certain they're not, because they're incredibly noisy. So we'll go ahead and click on the settings. Okay, so looking at our fans, first of all, we've got our CPU fan, which is the 3 fans on top of the radiator. They're taking the temperature off the CPU core, which is fine. They're running in auto mode. I'm going to go ahead and enable PWM mode. And you can see here they're running on the smart fan mode, which means they'll follow this curve, and that's what I normally do. So that fan's now running the way I want it to. If we go over to our pump fan, it's currently running in PWM mode. Importantly, this was a 3-pin connector that we have plugged into a 4-pin header, so it can't run in PWM mode. If you leave it in PWM mode, it'll just run at 100% all of the time. So we can go ahead and enable DC mode. Now you can see the pump speed up here. It's currently running at 100%. If we want, we can enable the same curve here by clicking on the smart fan mode, and you'll notice the pump speed will start to decrease. So in general, I don't tend to reduce the pump speed because I don't find a significant benefit in the noise levels. So we'll just go ahead and leave smart mode not enabled. And then the final fan that we've got plugged in is our fan hub into system fan 4. And it's actually our case fans that are running pretty noisily at the moment. And I'm sure you can hear the noise in the background. So they're running in DC mode, but it is a PWM fan hub. So if we go ahead and click on PWM, and hopefully you'll notice the noise in the background has started to go down. We'll probably get it to go down a little bit further if we enable the smart fan mode. Okay, so that's the fan setup. To save settings, we can just click the X button here. And then if we go ahead and click it again, it's going to tell us the things that we have changed, and we just need to go ahead and click yes, and then the PC will boot back into Windows. First thing for us to do is to check the RAM is running at the correct speed. So we right click on the Windows icon, click on Task Manager, click on More Details, click on Performance, and click on Memory. So we can see now the RAM is running at 3600 megahertz. So the next thing for us to do is to go ahead and install some drivers. Okay, so we're back over on our motherboards page over in MSI's website. So instead of the BIOS tab, we're going to click on the driver tab. We're going to select our operating system, and then I'm going to go ahead and expand these and show you which drivers are on offer. Okay, so we're not going to use RAID, so we don't need this driver. The AMD chipset driver we're going to get directly from AMD. The onboard VGA drivers we don't need. We don't have a CPU with integrated graphics, and we're going to get our drivers from NVIDIA. Onboard audio drivers we do need, so we'll go ahead and download these. And LAN drivers we need as well, so we'll download these too. Okay, so the downloaded compressed files we can uncompress. We right click on them and click extract and extract. And we'll do the same. Okay, we'll start with the LAN drivers. There's the setup. Click yes. Click next. Install. And we'll click on finish. Okay, we'll open the audio drivers. Scan down and we'll click on the setup file. Click yes. Click next. And we're going to need to restart our computer, so we'll click finish and do that. Okay, next driver for us to install is the chipset drivers, and we're going to get this from AMD's website. So we scan down to chipsets. We've got an AM4 socket and a B550 motherboard and click submit. We can then expand here and click download. So we head over to the downloads folder and click on the file. Click yes. And we can go ahead and click on install. Okay, so we're going to need to go ahead and restart our computer, so we'll do that now. Okay, last lot of drivers to get is the ones for the graphics card. So we're going to download the GeForce Experience by clicking download now. You can get the separate drivers. I much prefer to install this. Okay, we'll go ahead and open the file. Click yes. We're going to agree on install. And then if you have an NVIDIA account, go ahead and enter your details. If you don't, you can create one. I'm going to go ahead and put my details in now. Okay, I'm just going to skip the tour. And then we go ahead and click on the drivers tab. What it's already done is it's found a game ready driver. We have the option to change which drivers we install. So we can install game ready drivers. We use our PC mostly for gaming, or if you use it mostly for content creation, you can download the studio drivers. I'm keen to test gaming performance on this PC, so I'm going to go for the game ready driver and click download. Okay, I'm just going to go for an express installation. Click yes. And then it is fairly normal for the screen to flicker during the installation of the drivers. Okay, so that's the drivers installed. So before we move on to the next stage, we're going to have to deal with a problem with the PC, and these are fairly common when you're building PCs, and that is that there's quite a bit of noise coming from the fans, despite me having optimized them like I normally will in the BIOS. And this tells me the chances are this is probably coming from the fan hub, because that's the different step that I've taken compared to how I would normally set up a PC. And again, I'm suspicious it's our 3 Lian Li case fans that are causing the noise, because they're 4-pin connectors on them and I've plugged them into 3-pin connectors on the fan hub. And the fan hubs all vary a little bit about how well they'll work. So I'm going to take a quick noise level to give you an idea of what the problem is. So you can see there, when I wasn't talking, we had 51 decibels, which is fairly loud for a PC at idle. The quietest PC I've built is around about 30 decibels at idle, so 21 decibels above that. So the chances are, I would say our Lian Li case fans are running at 100%. What I'm going to do now is unplug them from the fan hub and see does that make a difference. Okay, so that's our 3 case fans unplugged from the fan hub. They're not spinning at the moment and the noise has dramatically reduced. We'll do another quick noise level. So we're getting 38 decibels there, so we've dropped the noise levels by 13 decibels to a much more acceptable idle noise level. So the next thing I'm going to have to do is plug these fans into the motherboard, and then we'll go back into the BIOS and set them up and see can we get the noise down any further. Okay, so looking at how the fans are set up, we can see they're taking the temperature of the CPU core, they're running in DC mode, and smart fan mode isn't enabled. Now, because these are 4-pin connectors, we can run them in PWM mode if we want. So I'll go ahead and click PWM mode and enable smart fan mode. Now, the only thing I'm noticing since I've done this, there's quite a bit of vibrating noise coming from the fans which are on top of the power supply shroud. I'm just going to swap it over to DC mode. And the vibrations have disappeared. So what I think I'll do, I think I'll run all these fans. I like to run them at the stock fan curves when I start my thermal testing. So I'm going to leave them in DC mode running on the smart fan mode curve, taking the temperature of the CPU core. So we'll just set the other fans up the same way. What I'll do now, I'll check another noise level from about the same place. Okay, so we're getting 40 decibels there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the fans as they are. I'm going to do my thermal testing and you're probably going to want to check out that video because I think there is going to be certainly some fan optimizations to make. And in particular, I'm going to test out the fans that I have installed, the Liandi case fans, compared to the stock fans and vary a few of the locations. So I think before you would follow this build guide, and particularly before you would purchase any parts, you probably want to see the thermal testing video, and that will be together with a case review. Okay, next thing to do is to show you how to get the software to control the RGB. Now you have a few options here. We can get away without any software if we want, because we can use the case buttons on the case, and I'll show you this in a minute, to cycle through all the different RGB effects on our AIO and all the fans installed. You won't be able to control the RGB on the motherboard or the RGB in the RAM without any software. You do have the option to turn the motherboard RGB off. There's a button down the bottom of the motherboard which lets you turn all the RGB off if you want. So it would just be the RAM. If you were happy with it set to its current settings, you could get away without any software. The reason I say this is the software that we're going to have to use over on the Utilities tab is the Dragon Center from MSI. There's no way to get Mystic Light without installing the Dragon Center at the moment. And some people have adversely complained about the performance of their PC after installing the Dragon Center. So it's up to you whether you install it, but if you want to control the RGB on your motherboard or the RAM, you're probably not going to have much of a choice but to install it. So I'll show you how to install it for completeness here. Okay, so we head over to our downloads folder, and then we're going to extract the Dragon Center. Click OK, click install. Okay, so we can go ahead and click on the Windows menu, right click on the Dragon Center, click on More and click on Run as Administrator. Click Yes, and then we can go ahead and click on Next. Scroll down to the bottom again, click I have read the terms and click OK. Okay, so we can go ahead and close this down, and what we're going to want to do is click on Mystic Light. Okay, so we have a look at the software here. What we can see, we have a couple of options to sync. We've got the motherboard and we've got our RAM. On the motherboard, everything is selected at the moment. If we want to change the RAM on the individual components, we can do that, or we can click on Select All. Our motherboard only has a tiny bit of RGB on it, but by having Select All selected, this header, which we have everything plugged into, will also sync as well. And importantly, remember this header, we have plugged in our RGB controller at the back, and then into that RGB controller, all our fans and our pump from our AIO are currently plugged into this as well. So if we leave Select All, it should change the RGB on everything. We can also control our RAM, and it's picked our RAM up here, and it's currently set to Rainbow. And if you look at the computer at the moment, the RAM is set to Rainbow. So we can use the button on the top of the case to cycle through the different effects. So I'm going to do that now and give you an idea what they look like. So you'll notice as I'm cycling through, the RAM isn't changing because it's not controlled by this button. It's only going to be controlled by the motherboard software. Okay, so if we want our motherboard to control all the RGB in the case, we need to hold this button in for 2 seconds. Okay, and I let go. Now if you look at all the fans have changed to Rainbow. The RAM is running on Rainbow and the pump should be running on Rainbow, so that is everything synced up with the motherboard. Now if I go over to our motherboard software, I should be able to change the colour of things now, and actually everything including the RAM will change colour. So it's selected to Rainbow at the moment. Say I wanted to go for a steady colour, let's click steady, and let's change everything to a steady white and click apply. So we can see everything now has changed to white. The motherboard's controlling things, and if we want to change our RAM, we can click on it. It's set to Rainbow at the moment. Let's go for the same thing, steady, drag things up to the top to get white and click apply. So at the moment now, the motherboard is controlling everything, and that's the only way we can actually get everything in the case to sync up. So what you'll notice, if I go back and press the case button again, it's going to go back and cycle through the case controls, but because the motherboard is currently set to white, the RAM and the motherboard won't change at all. So I'm going to leave things set to the motherboard, so I'm going to hold the button in for 2 seconds, 1, 2, and let go. Okay, so I'm just going to put everything back to rainbow because I think that looks pretty good. So I'll click on rainbow and click apply. And you can see the RAM has changed back to rainbow. Go to the motherboard, same thing, rainbow, and click apply. And then we've got everything set to rainbow. Alternatively, what we could do is sync everything, and then we would just have to control one setting here, but I wanted to show you the options in case you want to have different effects. So I'm going to leave everything at rainbow because I think that looks pretty good. Okay, that's the PC setup and everything's running really well. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you some footage of the completed build and then run some benchmarks to give you an idea of the performance you can expect from the PC. I think I am going to have a little bit more to do when it comes to optimizing the noise levels, so it probably is worth checking out my thermal testing video before you follow this build guide to see if I recommend any changes. So hopefully you found the video useful. If you have, please give it a thumbs up and remember to click that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video.
They keep on telling lies. That is how we stay alive. So you know that I don't mind about what is wrong and what is right. We keep moving.